Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Aya D. Simone. I'm a member of the board of the League of Women Voters of Greenwich, and I am co-chair of the Communications Committee. Welcome to another community event co-sponsored today by the League of Women Voters of Greenwich and PTAC. As you may or may not know, the League of Women Voters of Greenwich is a non-partisan organization which seeks to engage the public in an understanding of the issues and governmental decision-making that affects their lives. We partner with nonprofits and other non-partisan organizations to address specific issues of interest to our community. And this event is, as I said, being co-sponsored with one of those non-profit organizations, the PTA Council of Greenwich, which represents all 15 public schools, the PTAs of all 15 public schools here in our town. We're very happy to see so many of our members and non-member friends joining us today. Thank you again for your continued support and participation. And we hope that you enjoy the high quality, informative and engaging community conversations that we're bringing to you. If you do, please remember that our events are open to all our members, and also some are open to non-members. And if you'd like to become a member, it's easy to sign up on our website, lwvgreenwich.org. I'd like to give you a quick overview of how today's discussion will work. This is a webinar discussion which will be moderated, and we'll have an audience Q&A after the moderated discussion. The audience will be in view mode only. Only the presenters and the hosts will be visible and audio and have audio on today's webinar. For the Q&A following the discussion, you can ask your questions by clicking the Q&A icon, which you can see at the bottom right-hand side of your Zoom screen. You can type in those questions at any time. In fact, we already have some questions submitted, and our moderators will be monitoring that Q&A window, and we'll be asking the questions on a first in, first out basis, but we will be moderating that for duplicates and appropriateness. As a reminder, we will be recording this event, and it will be available on our website and on our YouTube channel from tomorrow for if you miss anything or if you'd like to share it with anyone in the community. We are on a tight schedule today, but we hope to be done by 8 p.m. If we find ourselves in the situation where we have many questions or are in the midst of answering a final question, we will extend for an extra 10 minutes if you'd like to continue. LWV Greenwich would like to thank our presenters and PTAC for partnering with us today to bring this event to our community. Remember, democracy works best when we engage in civil discourse, so we'd like to keep it that way. And remember, we are a non-partisan organization, and it is important for us to make sure that we conduct ourselves in that way. So now, without any further delay, I'd like to hand over to my fellow League colleague and board member, Ms. Becky Gillan. Becky, over to you.
Thank you. So I have a few slides from the Board of Education budget that I wanted to go over just to remind the audience of some of the dimensions we're talking about. So if I could see the slide share. Great. First slide. So I know we're talking about dollars and cents here, the capital budget, the operating budget, but I just want to remind people that at the end of the day, it's all about the best possible education for the almost 9,000 students enrolled in the public school system. And the mission really is about educating all students at the highest levels, enabling students to reach their potential, and really preparing students to become productive and compassionate members of society. So I know it's about dollars and cents for the budget, but we have to keep this in mind. Next slide. So what is the budget? Well, the operating budget as submitted February 2nd by Dr. Jones is $169 million. It's about 37% of the entire town of Greenwich budget. It represents a 3.97% increase, or about 6.5 million. I have to tell you, over the last 20 years, the increase has been about 3.23%. So it's quite in line with the historical averages. And the BET guideline was 3.3%. It's a little bit lower than what the BOE submitted, about almost $1 million. And that's because of 300,000 special ed tuition and 600,000 and 70,000 for restoration of materials and supplies. But it's pretty close in a $170 million budget. Now, the capital budget is $32 million. And major projects represent about 17 million. Infrastructure, which I'm sure we're going to get into, is about 12 million. Technology, 2.3, food service, 10,000, and security, 340. Next slide. So what is the 17 million? How does that break down for these big capital projects this year? Well, it's Western Middle School soil remediation, about 8 million. Cardinal field improvement at Greenwich High School, 4.8. The Greenwich High School secure entryway, 2.75. The Julian Curtis renovation design, the design only, 1.7 million. But there is money in the budget for the next fiscal year of about 25 million if it would be approved. And then finally, the Central Middle School renovation feasibility, 102,000. Although any idea of renovation is way down the road in the long-term budget. Next slide. So this is a hard slide to look at, and I don't necessarily want to go through it, but I just want to say that all the people in the Board of Education work on this budget almost 12 months a year. They start in June, July, and August. We're kind of moving towards the tail end because we're in January, February, and March. But this is a major, major process. Having said that, there's still time for the public to provide their input. So next slide. So this, again, this is off the Town of Greenwich website. It is the BET budget meetings, and you can tune in, there's Zoom links and passwords. But some of the big next things, if you want really not just to listen, but you want to have input. March 1, they're going to announce in public media that there's going to be a public hearing. That public hearing is March 29th from 7 to 10 p.m. So that's where you have your opportunity to really give your input to what you like and don't like about the budget. And there's still, there's a March 1st, a consolidation day, March 4th, a decision day, and March 6th, a decision day. That's for the bet. But the final approval is the RTM vote, which is scheduled right now, I think, for May 11, 2021. So we're really not at the end of the process, although I wish, some people probably wish they were. There's still time to give input. So with that, I'll turn it over to the moderators.
Good evening. Welcome everyone to the forum tonight. I'd like to first welcome and thank our panelists and introduce them, and thank them so much for everything they've done in the past year to make our town a very safe and desirable place to live and to go to school in. First, we have Dr. Jones, our Greenwich Superintendent of Schools. Second, we have Fred Camillo, the first Selectman, and we have Peter Bernstein, Chair of the Board of Education. So welcome to all of you and thank you for participating. My first question tonight is directed to Dr. Jones, and it's on the operating budget. What resources have been cut year after year and not restored that are impacting student learning and achievement? How much would it take to restore these resources to an acceptable level?
Thank you very much. That's a great question. What I will say first is that when we look at our budget process, we start out every year and really go through everything that's in the budget. And you know, on some years there are items that are reduced because that's what we need to be doing. But then there are also items that we reduce because we are trying to hit a guidance or a number. If I look at this year, when we first built the budget as a senior team, it was about $2.4 million more than what we actually presented to the Board of Education. And so we went back to the drawing board because we knew that number was too large. We have reduced just in the last year and a half, several positions out of central office that we've repurposed to take positions and use them differently. But we still have some areas like, for instance, elementary social workers that we would like to find a way, especially coming out of this pandemic, find a way to be able to fund some things like that. We've reduced quite a bit of professional development over the last few years, that has been a big item. It has not been as impactful over this last year because we couldn't really go to conferences and workshops in the same way that we would. So this will be something we'll need to analyze, I think, going into post-COVID environment to see what we really need in the professional development area. But again, it's an annual ongoing assessment of what we actually need to have in the budget. And we make those determinations as we build it, throughout the summer and coming into the fall.
Thank you. And I'll turn it over to you, Brian.
Thank you, Nancy. This is a question for Peter Bernstein and Dr. Jones in regard to maintenance. And I'm going to quote directly from the question that we received. Back in 2017, KG&D warned that GPS, quote, buildings are adequately maintained, but many of the buildings have roofs, ceilings, floors, windows, and ventilation systems that have reached their lifespan. Most of the schools will need the elements replaced in the next 15 years, unquote. And that was from the KG&D report and as recently exemplified by North Miamis. I continue with their question. As a taxpayer and Greenwich Public School parent, I feel I have the right to know if my child's schools are structurally sound, and if not, they need to be remediated immediately. Which schools in particular have roof, ceiling, floor, window, and ventilation systems that have reached their lifespan? And how will we address historic underspending on maintenance? 4 minutes, go ahead.
There's a lot in there, and it would probably take me about 20 minutes to respond to all of that. So let me give you the highlights. We all want safe schools. We also want schools that are effective for 21st century learning. The average age of our schools dates to the 1950s. Our oldest school, 1902, 1925, 1933, 1946. I think you get the idea. What we did learn from that master facilities plan is you should be spending 2 to 5% of the asset value of your buildings in terms of annual maintenance. We on average spend $10 million a year, and actually it's been lower in recent years, when the minimum of that 2 to 5% would be $20 million. So you'll see our requests are starting to ratchet up. We are looking at the systems in the buildings. We recently just requested an interim appropriation for the HVAC system at COSCOB. We actually had that in our budget request for this year, but the system's failing faster than we thought it should. We wanted to be in a position to replace that this summer. So work like that. If you look actually at our capital plan, on the first Selectman puts this together, there's about 200 pages in the capital submission that Fred made. You'll see a sheet that shows roofs. You'll see all of the schools listed there. North Miamis, actually a section of the roof I think is slated to be replaced in a couple of years. This was not a roof issue, by the way, and nor was this a maintenance issue. I think we need to differentiate the categories. Basic maintenance, major projects, which is some of the rehabilitation of the schools that we've talked about, Julian Curtis, Old Greenwich, Riverside, among them. This is infrastructure. These are the things that lurk and live behind the walls. When you have an old house, things go. And that's the same with our building. The things you don't see unless you invasively break into the walls, dig into the ceilings, and that's what's happening. And so in the past week, after North Miamis, working with the engineer in the town building department, they asked us to not have people in the buildings, Old Greenwich, JC, Riverside, the 3 oldest buildings that have been identified for major work, not have people in those buildings this week so they could be properly inspected. We're awaiting the engineer's report. The engineer will put that report in with the building department. They'll let us know if we can go back. Major projects, though, are really hard. They're expensive, as it was noted. Julian Curtis is upwards of $20 million. But if you want to keep a 75-year-old building functioning for the future, $25 million may be enough, because that's not a restoration of the building. That is basically fixing just a small number of deficiencies that exist in the building today. And it's the same for the other 2 schools. The reason those buildings are at the top of the list, well, one, they're old, but that's not why they got there. They got there because they have deficiencies in accessibility. They're not ADA accessible. That's not just putting an elevator on the building. They have issues with HVAC units. Actually, if you drive by some of them, they've got window units if they have them at all. And then on top of that, they have security issues. Look where the offices are versus the entryways. Look how people are able to access the building. Those are things that need to be rectified. Our challenge is we have a lot of needs and a lot of wants, as does the town side, and we're all competing for the same dollars that we want to get work done. For a very long time, Greenwich has had a very low mill rate. We all love the low mill rate, but we also love our facilities. We love our town, our town beaches, our town library, our town golf course. It's why people move here. And so at some point, we need to figure out how to have a conversation about doing more of these things, doing them in a time frame that actually makes sense. We basically kick the can down the road every year, as we can't put all of the projects we want on the list because we know they won't get funded. And the superintendent makes a list, she cuts things from that list. She goes to the Board of Ed, we cut things from that list. That list goes to the first selectman. Sometimes the first selectman cuts things. When it gets to the BET, they cut it again. Those projects don't go away. They just get pushed into the next year and the next year, and it pushes projects further out. If we want to get to the point where we can do things like know that all of our buildings are where we want them for 21st century learning, it's a real investment, it's a real commitment, and it's a real discussion that needs to happen. This isn't just about a one-off, spend a little money here, spend a little money there.
Thank you, Peter. Nancy, back to you.
This next question is directed to Fred Camillo, and it's on capital spending. The BET requested and funded, and the Board of Ed commissioned the facilities master plan for the district. Are projects currently planned, like rebuilding the ice rink at Dorothy Hamill and refashioning the Roger Sherman Park, more important than others identified by the school system as high priority, such as what we just discussed, the renovation of Julian Curtis, Old Greenwich Schools, and the reconstruction of Central Middle School? Do we need to reinstitute the capital improvement plan process to serve as a town-wide urban planning and prioritization process?
Thank you, Nancy, for that question. And good evening, everybody. It's great to be here with you all. Well, let me break that up into a couple of parts here. First, every project that's been requested of the BET has been funded over the last decade. I'm not aware of anything that hasn't been funded. I've heard this before in the last few weeks about, well, why are we doing the rink? Why are we doing the Civic Center? Why are we doing Roger Sherman Baldwin Park? Well, people move here for many reasons, right? They move here for the schools. They move here for the low taxation. They move here for the proximity to New York and to Boston. They move here for the high civic involvement. They move here because we have a hospital. We have a great library system. And so you have to balance it. We have to take care of everything. You just can't fund one thing at all. You mentioned a couple of things there. The rink. The rink was built in 1972. I used to go there with my aunt the first year. All it was a slab of ice and boards. It was done piecemeal. Hence, it's not one of the better rinks in Fairfield County. It's way overdue. The Civic Center was, we took that in 1967. That quickly was outdated, probably by the mid 80s. We've talked about that for about 30 years. It's falling apart. There's not going to be any Civic Center if we don't take action, and we're working on a P3 there. The GEM station, that's been 5 years in the making. We have that in the budget. We'd like to get that done this year. So we've taken the BOE's recommendations and put that in our budget this year. So our capital. So we're trying to address everything, but it's all about prioritization and making sure that there's a balance. If we just did all parks, that wouldn't be good. If we just did all schools, that wouldn't be good. People move here for lots of reasons, and we want to make sure that we address those reasons and not just keep up with everything, but stay ahead of it.
Well, thank you. And just a little bit of a follow-up. You mentioned public-private partnerships, and you said that there's some possibility, I think, related to the Civic Center. And so if you look at the several capital projects, such as Eastern Greenwich Civic Center, the park, Dorothy Hamill, how likely do you think it is that the town will be successful in achieving these public-private partnerships and thereby free up capital for the school projects?
Thank you, Nancy. I think that's a very good chance. We're already into deep negotiations with an anchor donor for the Civic Center. We've already had several people approach us about the rink, and I invited somebody who does this for a living, who's a friend in town, to come in and give us some pointers. And she was very helpful. She said that what Parks and Rec has done is very good, considering that's not what they do. That's not their main focus. And they gave us a little bit of a chip chart and your anchor donor, and then little chips of donations, and putting it in order, and it really makes sense. And so we are going to be following that. And yes, the whole goal is to free up some money so they can go to other places where it's badly needed.
Over to you, Brian. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is for Peter Bernstein, and sort of a follow-on to the previous question on ADA, HVAC, and safety. The BET has called upon the BOE to prioritize its capital needs. The BOE submitted a plan of prioritized projects for 15 years. It prioritized ADA compliance for 3 schools. Why are not all compliance needs being addressed in all schools in the next few years? In other words, should we be discussing the trade-off between making all ADA, HVAC, and safety fixes in the short term versus waiting until each building is rehabbed? Peter?
So great question. And if anybody hasn't seen it on the Greenwich Free Press, there's a great letter from Alan Gunsberg and Stephanie Cowie. I'm sure it'll be in the Greenwich Time tomorrow on ADA prioritization. The 3 buildings that pop to the front, Riverside, JC, Old Greenwich, none of them have elevators. Let's just start there for ADA accessibility. But this isn't about slapping an elevator on a building. This is actually about making sure all aspects of the building are accessible. Our doorways wide enough, our sinks available, even to the parking lot, right? Do we have the proper spaces? Can they get in the main entrance of the building? Go to Old Greenwich, they cannot. They actually enter in by the dumpsters. So those are things we need to fix. We're going to work on those 3 buildings first because they have major needs across all 3 categories. At the same time, we're annually doing other work, especially around ADA, especially around HVAC, especially around security. We've got money in our budget for all 3 aspects this year. There's money for HVAC for North Street. There's money for security cameras throughout the district, or post cameras that were put in post Sandy Hook that need to be replaced. There's ADA. I don't know if anybody's noticed, if you've been on a playground, you probably haven't. It's winter and it's COVID, but we've been slowly replacing the wood chips on the playground because you can't get a wheelchair on a playground where there's wood chips. So these things happen. They're happening over time. And as as Fred said, we have to prioritize, and we have been doing that. We had a master facility plan. You can see the main part of that plan on our website. There's a major appendix that our facilities staff actually uses for its annual capital requests. And basically that's guiding the work that we're doing so that we can get all of these things done in the order they need to be done in. We're looking at our I mentioned before, the COSCOB HVAC system. We knew we had a useful life of that. We were hoping it was the end of the next year. Unfortunately, it went out a little early, but we actually have a sense of that. And then every year we look at what needs to be done. They walk the buildings, they talk to the principals, they talk to the facilities team, and they make the decisions. And they're not easy decisions. We can't do everything at once. It's an impossibility. And to lock yourselves into a list that you're going to do for the next 15 years doesn't make sense. I always thought personally, when we did the master facility plan, the large building projects, I knew Greenwich was never going to pay for them in 15 years. There was just not a path forward at that point. But maybe there is a way forward. It's a conversation that I think the community needs to have about what they want. We prioritize the maintenance and keeping the buildings up and running, but there's bigger things behind that need to get done. It's the same on the town side. It's why we work with the first selectman and his team to try to figure out. But this year, and I'm sure this will come up when you're talking to the BET members, the budget guideline letter that the BET puts out that is an expectation that we're all going to meet it, says this: capital projects are projected at $55 million of prioritized projects to cover required annual maintenance expenses, remediation, and a few improvement projects. $55 million. Now, between the regular facilities, maintenance for the schools in the town and the payments we make on our annual bonding, we bond over 7 years, there's not really a whole lot left for a lot of projects. And so we do need to step back. It is not an easy thing to say, we're going to do this year just ADA. Guess what? The old way they did facilities planning in the district was this year we're going to do all lights, whether or not they needed new lights or bathrooms or painting or whatever it was. The way that we do it now is based on a plan that the BET asked us for, that we funded, the town funded, and we're using that to actually make better decisions about what gets prioritized. But again, we can't do it all, and that's just where we are, and we want to be in a better place where we can do more.
Thank you, Peter. Nancy?
I'd like to direct the next question to Fred, and that's on the recently completed athletic field study. The lack of fields in town impacts the quality of our students' school experience and the education budget. For example, we have higher transportation costs, basically transport school teams. When we look at the costs of creating and maintaining athletic fields, we don't consider these costs, nor do we consider the offsetting revenues from outside organizations renting these fields. Are there plans to do such an analysis now that the study has been completed? Maybe you can talk a little bit more about the plans for this study too. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. Yeah, so that word that's in the study, and it's about 100 pages long. It's on the Parks and Rec website. That was basically driven by user groups that they interviewed and that were very vocal over the last several decades, and also individuals in town in various parts of town. Whether it's on school grounds or just parkland, we know that sometimes we haven't kept up with other towns, and that was for many reasons. But I know the Parks and Recreation Department's really focused on it now, and people were alarmed when they saw the study, because the study came back and identified 27 park-owned fields, and it looked as if a couple of them were out of place. Like, for example, I'll give you Lachlan Avenue. I was on a Zoom the other night with the neighborhood association, and I explained to them it's just a concept and it's not even close to being funded, but that particular rendering fits well in certain venues, but it didn't fit in that particular park, which is right smack dab in the middle of a neighborhood. So this has been a long time coming. I know Parks and Rec is really focused on this, and the schools, it spoke to user groups all over town, people who go to private schools and public schools. It talked about usage, reconverting fields where there's diamonds, where there's all-purpose fields, how you combine them, how you get the parking in there, which also, Nancy, becomes a sticking point. Because once you start adding impervious surfaces, right, people start to get alarmed. But you need parking if you're going to have a field. So not every field that's rendering or proposal that's in that study is going to happen. But it's good to have this conversation now. And a lot of them are, some are on a Board of Ed properties there, that it's critical, because athletics, and I'm a sports guy, athletics is a huge part of growing up. To me, it's right up there with education. It's part of the experience. And, we really want to make sure we have enough venues and safe venues and accessible venues. And, Peter talked before about ADA compliance. We also want to make sure they're ADA inclusive, not just compliant, but inclusive. So if you haven't had a chance to go on there, look at that study. There's a lot in there, but there's a lot more to come. This conversation has just started, but we really want to get moving on this, because, for somebody that's growing up right now, is 13, 14, 15, they're not going to be able to wait around 6 or 7 years. They'll be past the age that they get able to use them.
Thank you. And let me turn it over to Brian.
This is for Dr. Jones and Peter Bernstein in regard to special education. If the consulting group PCG's report does recommend increased staffing or in-district services to avoid out-of-district placements, will GPS be able to address those recommendations immediately, assuming, and we're going to ask the same question to the other group, assuming interim funding is requested by the BOE and approved by the BET and the RTM?
So I'll start off and turn it over to Toni. I think, look, we're all very interested in the results of this study. We wanted an independent study. We want an action plan at the end of this based upon their findings. What that will look like, we don't know yet. We haven't seen it. We will hopefully in a few weeks to months. But at the end of the day, some of the recommendations they make may not be about money. And I'm sure many of them will not be about money. And to the extent some of them are money, we do send a lot of students out of districts. Some are settlements, some are because we don't provide services. If we can bring them back, there may be a savings of money. If we do need money, it's a conversation we've already started with the BET. Certainly we talked to the BET Budget Committee about it. And when the superintendent put her budget forth to the board, we had a discussion. Should we ask for $500,000 as seed money? But not knowing exactly what it would go to, we really weren't in a position to ask for that money at that point. I guess, Toni, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, I think you answered it, Peter. Until we see the study and what they're actually recommending, that's a hard question to answer. It could be how we utilize the staff that we already have and moving staff from, one position to another, but we won't know until we see the study.
Thank you. Nancy, I'll turn back over to you, and we're right on time.
Great, perfect. Now we're going to turn to the second phase of the forum tonight, and we have representatives from the BET and the RTM. We can look at the first phase is the people who request the money and the entities that request the money. The second phase is representatives from people who are improving the funding requests or not. And so I'd like to welcome the panelists here and thank them for participating. We have Mike Mason, chairman of the BET. Leslie Moriarty, a member of the BET and head of the Democratic Caucus, and Kim Blank, chair of the RTM Education Committee. So again, thank you so much for participating. And I'll start it off with a question for Mike and Leslie on capital spending. The school district has a plan for facilities maintenance and construction, aspects of school operations that have been neglected for many years. In fiscal 20 and 21 alone, the BET cut $24 million from the Board of Ed requests for capital funding. For the fiscal 2022 budget cycle, the BET guidelines set a total capital spending level less than half of what was in the long-term capital plan. What is the BET's long-term plan to accommodate the significant prioritized capital funding needs that have been articulated by the school system over the next 5 years? And I'll turn it first to Mike and then to Leslie. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. First of all, thank you, everyone, for having us. It's really it's a pleasure to represent the BET, and we'll try to get through these answers. And I would say, Peter Bernstein, you got some hard questions, and bless you for getting through those. So the capital spending for the Board of Ed. As we have heard, the Board of Ed agreed to do a review of all their facilities back in 2017. And they performed that study, and that report recommended priorities for the board. It included HVAC, security, Central Middle School, but what it didn't include was the remediation projects. It didn't include the stadium phase 1 and phase 2. Those have kind of come up as we're waiting for approvals and what have you. The question was out there about why we didn't approve the last couple of years of capital requests from the Board of Ed. One example comes to mind was Western Junior High's remediation. I think that number is $8 or $9 million. Last year, it was in the budget, and it was not funded simply because we didn't believe we were going to have approvals from the state to commence the work. And I think that dialogue is going to happen this year too, waiting to see. The year before, there was a double request for feasibility studies for Julian Curtis and Old Greenwich. And at that time, there was a discussion about, do we want to do feasibility studies that far ahead of doing the project? And at that time, the decision was just to postpone one. So with that in mind, the BET's long-range plan has been and should continue to increase maintenance allocations when funding these large projects within the Board of Ed operations. And the next question, you'll hear me answer that differently. We continue to seek operational efficiencies, obviously, in our plan, continue to fund the capital allocation, and more important, if you look back at the way we funded, we take the surplus from projects and we freeze that for the next project that comes along. So it's important to note that since 2006, we've put $290 million into our school buildings between maintenance and large projects. And that doesn't include projects done by our Department of Public Works for the schools, which is a tab in the budget you can find. And that roughly comes up to about a $20 million average. It's a little lumpy with the big projects, but currently the Board of Ed, as we sit here today, has got $30 million in capital. They're working on diligently, making progress on that. And we're about to add another roughly $30 million. So I think that's the plan, and that's what we've been doing. And I think it's been working, and you can see we've put a lot into our infrastructure.
Oops, Leslie, you're on mute.
So thank you. I also want to thank the League of Women Voters and PTA Council for sponsoring this. It's an important topic for members of the community, so I appreciate it. Just building on Mike's points, as he pointed out, the projects that weren't approved the past couple of years, there are a few really large ones. I would point to the $15 million that were not appropriated for Cardinal Stadium and the Western Middle School remediation. But the one project that was delayed, which was disappointing last year, was the architectural and engineering funding for the Julian Curtis School. As Mike pointed out, it's only been since 2018 that there is a detailed facility maintenance plan that the Board of Ed is operating under. I think prior to that, they did their best trying to meet their needs, but also trying to fit within budget expectation, the budget guidelines and the BET's expectation. We need to fix that dynamic so that all departments know that they should be coming to the BET to ask for what they need. If the guidelines don't represent their needs and there are major differences, the BET needs to hear about that. So fiscal 20 was the first time we had a presentation of their complete master facility plan. And I think that we don't need any more evidence that it's critical that we fund this plan, and we try to do it in the time frame in which it's requested. But we do have to recognize that not everything can be done at once, that the Board of Ed does need the ability to refine the request each year as their needs change, as certain new information comes about their facilities. And we also need to make sure that the administration has the resources in terms of staffing or other funding to implement the plan. The same impatience really will cover our major renovation projects. You can't do everything at once. There can be a debate over whether you do a little bit in every building or whether you do everything in one building at a time and there is a sequence of projects. The Board of Ed has opined on that. They voted to major renovations, one building at a time. And there are challenges to embarking on these projects, but I think that the BET, or I would hope the BET, is a willing partner in trying to move these things forward. Unfortunately, what has happened in the past is that the discussion at the BET tends to start with how to fit the plan into the BET's financing model. And that's a conversation that needs to change. The question really should be, how do we change the financing structure to meet the identified investment needs? Thank you.
All right, before I turn it over to Brian, I just wanted to remind the audience that if we have time at the end, we'll be responding to their questions. They can put those into the Q&A function here. Just a reminder in that regard, because it won't be an open mic to do that. So Brian?
Turning from capital spending to operating spending, the BET has set guidelines about 2% increase cap since 2012. This is below the negotiated teacher salary increases of about 3% a year, and salaries make up 80% of the operating budget. This means either efficiencies need to be found, and they've done a good job of finding efficiencies, or programs need to be cut in order to balance the budget each year. Going forward, how might Greenwich better resolve this budget tension? And this is for both Mike and for Leslie.
So, Leslie, you want me to go or you want to go?
Why don't I take this one first?
Okay.
You know, the way I look at it from a BET perspective, I feel like the Board of Education is different from almost all our other town departments. The Board of Education is more like a for-profit business entity that has changing customer needs, evolving technology, and higher goals for services every year. The way that we have funded or evaluated budget guidelines in the past, which kind of set the parameters for the Board of Ed to look at their budget, it is a strict % increase over their current budget. And Brian, as you identified, it often means trade-offs of old programs for any new ones that they want to institute. And the Board of Ed's been a good partner with the BET in trying to work within that system. But now it seems like we're not having the right conversation. The makeup of the student population, the parent expectations, the increased state requirements are all changing the way we need to look at school funding. And I think that we also agree, though, that funding is not always the answer to address those needs, those new needs. So money isn't always the answer. But I think going forward, the BET should be funding the negotiated labor contracts in the budget guidelines as we continue with that process. It should also reflect and acknowledge trends in enrollment, changes in educational delivery, changes in the demographics, the new mandates, and expect effective operations, and looking for the Board of Ed to look for changes in how they deliver their services as much as possible. We've got to figure out a way for the Board of Ed and the administration to have a communication with the BT about these changes and how it affects their costs of operations and how it affects their goals and their outcomes. You know, we've used benchmarking in the past to try to understand where we are in terms of funding, but it really is difficult to get apple to apples data from town to town, and that has to be recognized. Look, the BET's role is also not difficult, just like the Board of Ed's. We're trying to balance the support for our schools with the cost to the taxpayers. We have a current very strong administration, an effective superintendent, and we need to find a way to support her, to support the rest of the administration, and not make their jobs more difficult. An excellent school system is one of Greenwich's strongest community values, and the BET should be evaluating our processes to be able to have the right conversation about the funding.
So let me put a little twist on this question. So you had an earlier slide which showed the Board of Ed budget at their request at $167 or $169 million. And that's for their operational expenses. But Greenwich is very unique. And let me give you some examples. So in the Board of Ed budget, that's their operating budget. And it's very hard for us at times to explain this even to the residents. The budget guidelines do call for an increase in our operating budget, but let's look at the Board of Ed budget. This year, the Board of Ed in their operating budget, we're going up $7 million in cash from dialogue we've had with them. Union contracts, out of district tuition, and their salary accounts. They're in our guidelines back in December, we recognize that from the dialogue we're having with them, that money's in there, okay? But the dialogue about some of the other funding that we'll have, and we'll have that as the years goes. But here's what people don't understand. I think the BET has been very supportive of Board of Ed policies, and I think we should continue to do this. We've supported the Board of Ed policy for the highest starting salaries for teachers, the lowest class size guidelines for any peer community, the high level of curriculum, maintaining the neighborhood school network. Anything we funded towards student achievement, we have fully supported on the BET, smart boards, digital learning, and it goes on. But what the people in the town need to understand is what's not in the Board of Ed budget that the BET must support in order for the schools to deliver. Let me give you an example. So the Board of Ed is not responsible in their budget to have to anything to do with healthcare, contractual cost, pension unfunded liability for their non-certified staff, workers' comp cases, school resource officers, legal expenses, all the fields and ground maintenance, snow removal, all of that's outside of their budget, all the fleet expenses for the vehicles, all the insurance premiums, all the legal settlements, that they don't have to come up with that. Then the BET has been very successful funding programs like Teen Talk and Kids in Crisis. We do that in an external entity and so much more. You know, one more note we're looking at it, and I think Leslie Moriarty touched on it, is right now our actual student spending per pupil is actually on the rise because of the declining enrollment. And this year, I think we're purposely staying away from that because we don't know if this is just a slight blip due to COVID. We're not sure, and I don't think the Board of Ed knows because the Board of Ed historically is right on the money with their enrollment numbers. So we're doing everything we can, not only to fund the Board of Ed budget, but we have the other segments of the budget that are rising much faster than a CPI, and we have to keep the other departments funded as well because they're delivering services that produce the educational product in town. So I think when people put that together, I think then you start adding it up, and our spending is generous in town, and we want good results. We want accountability, and our Board of Ed's doing. Obviously, we're all in the COVID world right now. But we want high academic achievement. And you'll hear that on the BET through up and down, through 2009 economic crush, 2006 good times. You'll hear that. And we strive for that. And I hope we continue to do that.
Thank you, Mike. And I guess our next question is directed on the topic of long-term borrowing, and it's directed to Leslie, Mike, and Kim. Low interest rates indicate a traditionally good time to borrow. What is your view on long-term borrowing to address the school's significant capital needs? And I'd address it first to Leslie, then to Kim, and then to Mike. So thank you. Leslie, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry. So the current assumptions in our capital plan that was given to us from the first selectman do not support the needs of the town and schools. It breaks down in a few years when we start having to pay back debt after having $90 to $100 million of spending over the next 4 years. So there are only a few variables that the BET has available to finance projects. We can change the total amount of funding that's needed, but we've just had a long conversation about what's needed at the schools, and Fred very carefully outlined what's needed on the town side. The two other variables are the amount of the taxes that we have that we earmark to fund capital. Now, in the past, not in the past 4 years, but before that, to build up a base of the amount of taxes we have for capital, which currently this year is $51 million, we have added a little extra points to a mill rate increase to order to increase that number. That 51 million has been flat for 2 years and has only been modestly increased before that. That is what's really holding us back from being able to fund even more of the necessary projects that we have. We're looking at, in the current financial budget proposal, there's use of available fund balances, but that only gets you so far because after a year or two, you don't have more fund balances to use for that. And then the third piece of it is debt maturities. If you take the remediation projects, for example, and want to pay those back over 20 years instead of over 5 years, that will free up $4 to $5 million a year to fund debt for other projects. I think it's a tool that the BET has to look at. I think it's not a solution all by itself, but it should be a tool that we use carefully, along with looking at our tax rate for capital and, of course, vetting projects that are in that budget. Thank you.
Oh, hi, thanks. And thank you for having us here tonight. I think it's terrific that you're hosting this panel. I think our pay-as-you-go policy that we've had has typically served the town pretty well financially, but we are now dealing with aging school buildings with a variety of educational, accessibility, and now unfortunately safety issues. It's clear that we have a lot of school projects coming our way, and getting them all done in a timely fashion may require us to rethink how we finance them if we want to continue having low predictable mill rate increases. So the thing that I think is critical is that we don't make financing decisions on a one-off basis or just in a reactive way. If we are going to change our longstanding custom of borrowing for the life of the project rather than for the life of an asset, it should be something that's a community discussion that we all have a chance to weigh in on, members of the BET, the Board of Ed, and the RTM.
So let's try this. Financing terms and borrowing and long-term debt, modest debt, has been a dialogue in town at levels that one would never expect. So here's my thoughts on what the town needs to do. The town needs to support and continue borrowing in tranches to meet the cash flow needs of capital projects. Most people, it takes a second for us to explain that. Okay, the practice that the BET has been done, it's available, it's up for review. We've just renewed our debt policy. It's on our webpage. Interest rates. When we go to market, we check the conventional borrowing rates for 20 and 30 years versus what we do in the tranches and the bands at the 5-year notes following the bands. The difference is 1.8% of a rate. So the question to the taxpayer is, every time you want to borrow $10 million, do you want to pay an extra $1.8 million in interest back? Okay. Some say this is an option to get us out of that. And I do agree with that. However, we're working on things in town right now. We're working on a reform on our pension obligation for the unfunded liability that would free up a significant amount of cash. We're working on getting rid of, or let me rephrase that. We're working on restructuring the Nathaniel Witherell so that facility is not a huge cash drain on us to be able to have resources in these efficiencies and move them over into the capital model. So I'm going to give you an answer I heard in the Board of Ed meeting the other night that really sums this question up. And it was by the two Peters. And they both came out and said the Board of Ed inherited a lot of facilities that needed a lot of work. through the 1970s, through the 80s and the early 90s, we did no formal upkeep of our buildings. It was a Board of Ed chair, Jenny Kroeb, who went to the first selectman and said, we get $2 million a year to maintain our buildings. And that stopped right there, and it's been growing ever since. But I go back to what the Peters said. They did inherit. They inherited buildings that we've been doing upgrades. The Board of Ed, just like me at home, makes decisions on wants versus needs. You know, we've postponed some projects. You know, the auditorium project became an important project versus redoing a couple schools, and that's their discretion, and we follow it. But what I heard both of them say at the end is, yes, we want to spend more and do more upgrades, and I think they have the support of the community. But they also said, but we still have the kids that we're dealing with, working around the kids, and that's a challenge. And that really comes down to that being more of an issue, I think, than our funding mechanism. The capital model in the book right now, that's before the BET, calls for about $350 million of capital in the next 3 years. I've often said, if we were paid interest and we borrowed for 50 years, that would still have a devastating impact on the model. So we have to figure it out. We have to prioritize, and we'll keep doing that. So the current debt model is working. There's never a dialogue that say we would not look at anything else. That's not on the table. We'll do what we need to do. But on the other hand, we have to work on finding efficiencies and prioritizing, because we just can't do it all at once. And I think you've heard 3 people say that.
Thank you. And I'd like to turn it over to Brian.
Okay, this question is for the 3 of you again in regard to Cardinal Field. And this is sort of a what if. For the Cardinal Field Phase 2, how much certainty about timing and cost does the BET and RTM need to approve the request for this budget year, 2021, 2022, as opposed to pushing for next year? And we'll start with, we'll start with Mike, and then Leslie, and then Kim.
Thank you.
1 minute too. Keep it short.
Cardinal Stadium, certainly, as far as timing, I want to say to PTA Council and the League of Women Voters, this is probably one of the most interesting questions of the night. Our current capital model for Greenwich High School, let's just talk about Greenwich High School for 3 years. We have to finish up Stadium Project 1A and 1B. We have $4.5 million of interior capital work. We have a security entrance building addition, which is now in building committee form and about to get funded. We have remediation for fields 2, 3, and 4. That's a 3-year project according to AECom. And we have phase 2 of the stadium. And then to add to that, the state of Connecticut is doing the bridge on the Post Road for a 3-year project at Hillside Road. I'm going to step away from the finance role here, and I'm going to sympathize with the Board of Ed. I don't know how much we can throw at Greenwich High School and what the impacts will be to the staff, the neighbors, the kids on that project. So as far as the timing, we know that phase 2 has got some lengthy hurdles for timing, but I just question all of the logistics and the ability to commit to all this and what the impacts are going to be to the community.
Leslie?
Okay, so I'll add to that based on what information's been given to the BET so far. We have a CIP page in our capital budget book for 4.8 million, and it's one number with no detail. I think this project is still pretty early in its planning phases. It has a identified conceptual approach, but it doesn't have much specifics in terms of engineering or real costs. And typically we would have more detail on the costs of for planning, cost for a specific construction design that's going to be used, the associated expenses with that, understanding the environmental or other site challenges for the specific project before we would move ahead with the appropriation. So we've asked the Board of Ed for some more information, but I think that there's still a lot unknown with that project. And we've asked them potentially, maybe it makes sense to phase their request, get more planning dollars to be able to answer those questions. But so it's still uncertain in my mind how that proceeds right now.
Yeah, I agree. You know, there's a lot of uncertainty around this. I think it's unclear what the Board of Ed will even be able to get approvals to build on this site. But I do think there needs to be enough money in next year's budget to help them continue moving forward with design work and with the various approval processes. So having watched the budget committee hearings, I don't think the Board of Ed has yet said what that number is, but when we know what it is, we should fund enough to make sure that future phases of the project are moving forward.
Nancy?
The next question is on special education, similar to what we asked in the first section. And if the consulting group PCG's report does recommend increased staffing or in-district services to avoid out-of-district placements, will the Greenwich Public Schools be able to address those recommendations immediately? For instance, in the budget 21-22 year, via an interim appropriation. I'd like to direct that first to Leslie, then to Mike, and then to Kim.
So usually when a study is delivered, just like we had discussions previously on the field study, there has to be some work done by the staff to internalize and review the information in that study, and then to develop an implementation plan. Once that work is done, and if needed, additional resources are identified and supported by the Board of Ed and Superintendent, then I would encourage the Board of Ed to seek the funding that is needed. I think we all want to see the needs of that community met. It's not clear what the scope of those recommendations will be. You know, I point to an example where last year the BET did not fund the special education out of district tuition, and that is a separate category, not what the study is looking at. But when we don't fund certain initiatives, what that does is it asks the administration to really try to cover those costs and only come to the BET and then the RTM for additional funding if they can't cover the costs. And I think that places an undue burden on the staff to try to incorporate costs that we know about and that we anticipate. And while this particular study is not happening on the cycle that works with our budget, I think we should be open to listening to those needs and trying to address those needs when we can.
I really would like to just use Peter Bernstein's answer to this question, because I think he really got it correctly phrased. We understand when the study comes back, there's going to be options, and as Ms. Moriarty said, there'll be options and implementation steps and whatever. Any board and commission in a town should never, ever worry about having to, if there's a need for finances, to do an interim appropriation. I know some people don't like to hear that, but that's just part of our government. It's part of our structure and what's permitted. We've been having a lot of dialogue with the Board of Ed as a liaison with Ms. Moriarty to schools. We've been to the meetings. We've heard the angst in the Board of Ed wanting to make improvements. We've heard the superintendent wanting to address this and get this, out of district tuition and special ed under control. We've supported them, and the dialogue will continue. And their needs, obviously, as Leslie Moriarty says, if they come into a financial situation and they don't have the resources, there's a process for that. And our phones and emails around. We're open to the process all the time.
Sure. The special education situation is something that many members of the Education Committee have a particular interest in and are particularly attuned to. I've sat through the various Board of Ed meetings where multiple parents of special needs students have talked about their experiences, and listening to them, it's hard not to feel like some things really do need to change. And I know we're all eager to hear the results of the PCG study and see their recommendations. Without knowing the report's results, it's hard to predict whether implementing recommendations will require additional money in the operating budget. Ideally, as Peter Bernstein said, the recommendations would lead to a reduction in the outplacement tuition costs and settlements, which is slated to be a very big line item for next year. But as a practical matter, you have to realize there probably is some delay between implementing new recommendations and then realizing whatever reductions you can in outplacement costs. And if the Board of Ed doesn't think it can implement within next year's budget, then we absolutely should look at an interim appropriation so things don't get further delayed, because given the potential gaps from a pandemic year, and then how precious I know as a parent every single school year is for a student, speed is absolutely of the essence on this. And we do need to make sure we can get things implemented as quickly as possible. Financing should not be the gating factor.
Brian?
Okay. We're used up all of our time for that section. We're going to go to a couple of questions from our audience. First one is, the BOE has seen several water leaks over the last several years, which have cost insurance companies millions of dollars. The consequence beyond disrupted education is that in the town's property insurance cost has increased by over $1 million. While the BOE doesn't pay this cost, what is their plan to do better? As a homeowner, what you need to do when the weather is cold is walk your home to watch for leaks. What is the BOE doing to monitor their properties? And I'll turn that over to Peter or Dr.
Yeah,
Jones.
I'll grab that, and I think if Tony wants to weigh in, and Mike and Leslie have some experience with this as well. Actually, Coscob was a water leak, but it was from a faulty faucet. It wasn't actually the pipes that were leaking, and from that and some of the issues at the high school, we've been looking at different water monitoring activities. How we can put sensors in the building, staffing the building so that we have people there sometimes off hours. On cold days, we have our custodians come in over the weekends, even on breaks. And Fred's going to hate this because he's on us to cut our fuel costs, but we run the heat when we're on break to keep the buildings warm so the pipes don't freeze. These aren't all water issues. North Miami certainly wasn't. It looks based on the engineer's findings that it was the ceiling that gave out. So not a water issue. It did break a water line, but there are things that we're doing to make sure there's better monitoring in place. We do, though, have 1 million square feet of buildings, so it's a little bit different from I don't know how big the requester's home is, but if you've got, let's say, a 2,000 square foot home, I don't know if that's the average for Greenwich. It's easy to check your places. The high school water leaks, by the way, were a result of parts being installed in the wrong direction, probably the wrong parts for the wrong use. They were out behind walls, so there was nothing you could do to see them. The idea, though, is to try to get ahead of it so that if there's a water issue in the building, the firemen, who typically are the first ones to come and respond, know where the water mains are, they can cut them off, they can get to it quick. And I think that pretty much sums it up. And Dr. Jones, I don't know if you have anything you want to add.
No, I think you did great. I do just want to confirm that with North Miami, we did get the engineering report right before I got on this call, and it is the plaster ceiling that then fell on the water pipe. So it wasn't a pipe breakage on its own.
Nancy, over to you.
Sure. Greenwich spends more per pupil than any other town in Fairfield County, yet achievement is low. What specific steps is the Board of Ed doing to improve achievement? I think I direct that to Dr. Jones.
I think that we are focused on student achievement all the time. And I have, I guess, a different point of view that I think our students perform amazing. I looked last year at the end of the year, and our advanced placement results in our high school were within 2 percentage points of the year before, pre-COVID. And that was in the middle of a pandemic. Our students were able to take some of the highest level exams in the United States. And those students are a product, a vast majority have been in our system since pre-K and kindergarten. So, I think our results are strong. We can always get better and improve in areas, and we work on that all the time. We have a brand new system called Link It this year that we are implementing in our up through really 8th grade. High school, they're using it a little bit differently, but it's again to really help us understand mastery of standards. When I look at how our students did last year coming out of the pandemic, is difficult as it was when we did our assessments at the beginning of this year, they did really well. So I'm proud of our students and our student achievement, and we're going to continue to get better and better because that's what we believe is the right thing to do as a school system.
Well, let me just add to that. So Toni repositioned people that were in the Havemeyer building and turned them into math coaches in the elementary school, because we've been watching the math scores and noticed that we needed more intervention there. And so taking our resources and putting them in the right place at the right time is really important. So the data system that Toni mentioned, Link It, is allowing us to look at an individual student level, at a class level, a grade level, a building level. And so basically putting data to practice and then putting resources where needed. And I think that's the approach that we envisioned 5 years ago in our strategic plan. And we're actually doing it, which is great.
I'll take the next one. I think we're going to do one more question. We have about 25 questions, so we appreciate everybody sending in questions. Maybe what we'll do is we'll print these and send them along and see if we can get them posted somewhere with answers. Last question here is, many BOE members seem to blame the BET for the lack of maintenance of its buildings. Isn't it true that the BOE has prioritized other projects that cause maintenance to be deferred? So I'll turn that over to Peter.
Yeah, I think that actually you ought to talk to the BET members there as well. We actually do maintain and prioritize our projects. We've done that, for a couple of years now, thanks to the master facility plan requested by and funded by the BET. That is actually driving the requests that we're doing. So this false narrative that we don't actually prioritize just doesn't fit well with me. Basically, what the process I outlined earlier is the process that happens. Our facilities team, our administrative team, they take the list of the projects that they know are up for that year. They walk the buildings, they look at things, they use our external experts. So we've got HVAC people that come in and inspect. That's how we knew COSCOB needed to be done a little earlier. They make the request based on the actual needs. That's how we prioritize. It's done using that plan, but it's checked annually. To blindly say we're going to adopt a plan and this is all we're going to do for 15 years, doesn't actually work in the way that the buildings work. Again, it's 1 million square feet. And I think people should know the estimated replacement value of our buildings is $1 billion. So we actually want to make sure we're doing the right maintenance at the right time. This is part of, I think, a campaign by some in town. It's the blame game, basically. I'm not sitting here blaming certain members of the BET. I'm not blaming the Board of Ed. I'm not blaming the superintendent. We have a system in town we've all benefited from. We have low mill rate increases, folks. That's the way we've wanted it forever. If we want to change that, if we want to talk about long-term financing, it's going to be the BOE, the BET, the RTM, and guess what? All the citizens in town, all the parents who want these projects done without haste need to engage in that conversation. And we need to say, can we change our model in a way that doesn't impact us down the road, that we aren't taking on unnecessary debt, that we're not long-term financing ridiculous things, that we're taking a look at the projects that need to be done and how we can do them. I'm not going to call out Dr. Jones to talk about it, but she when I asked her what did her other districts do, 2 of the 3 districts, the last 3 districts that Dr. Jones was in, did long-term bonds. What did you say, $150 million bond in one of the districts? And they did all of their work all at once. Mike said that one of the issues is about moving kids. It actually is Mike that, people say we have a lot of capacity in our system. Mike is actually the one who pointed out you should have capacity in your system so that as you do these projects, you can actually use that capacity to move your kids. Thank you, Mike, for acknowledging that. So we have to take this on in an appreciable way. We're prioritizing. We're working with the BET to prioritize. We work with the first selectman to prioritize. Stop putting this false narrative out and stop trying to blame everybody. This isn't about blame. This is about people collectively working together, rolling their sleeves up, finding solutions to problems. So if I continue to read, the BOE isn't prioritizing, it'll be the same thing again and again and again. We do this. We do this all the time. If you pay attention, if you sit through our meetings, our last one was 5 hours. So I get if you don't want to sit through them. Nancy Weisler spent years on the Board of Ed. Leslie Moriarty spent years on the Board of Ed. And there's a reason they're not on the Board of Ed anymore. Sandy Waters was on the Board of Ed. This is a hard job, folks. We do it because we care about the students. We care about the town. Don't make it harder than it needs to be. We don't point fingers. Stop pointing them at people that you're not getting the facts straight.
Okay, well, I will wrap up there with one comment that I heard the words community discussion in several of the answers. So I'm going to look to Fred to say, maybe there should be a community discussion, including, BOE, BET, RTM members, the administration, the selectmen, and the parents and taxpayers. So I just made my comment there. I'll say thank you on behalf of PTA Council to all of the panelists and everybody that participated. I'm going to turn it back over to Aya. Thank you.
Can I just say one thing before I turn it over to Aya, is just to thank everyone for participating, and also saying we've had a lot of great questions in the chat tonight. And I would, since we couldn't basically address all of them, I would suggest that you reach out to your representatives. I know that they'd like to continue this discussion with you. So thank you.
Thank you, everybody. I think we can all agree on one thing, that this was a very informative discussion. I think that we could have gone on for hours, given the number of questions that we had. But what I also noticed was the high quality of questions and high quality answers that were given. And I appreciate all of the participants for that. Everybody who submitted a question, thank you. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get through them. We will do our best to see if we can get those answered and then circulated to you after this event, hopefully within the next couple of days. Remember, if you want to see anything that you may have missed, including the video of this event, you can see those on our website at lwvgreenwich.org. You can also sign up for upcoming events, become a member if you're not already a member, and you'll get to see lots more of these fabulous events. You'll get to participate in things that are not just community discussions, but specifically for members only. That's lwvgreenwich.org if you would like to do that. And for tomorrow, we will be sending out an email that will include a link to this video. So if you want to review anything that may have been discussed, or if you want to share it with others who might be interested, please do so. And also remember, if you can always follow us on social media. We're on Facebook and Instagram. So again, I'd like to thank PTAC. I'd like to thank Fred, Dr. Jones, and all of our participants and hosts. Again, please do visit our website for more information, and do sign up with us for our upcoming events. Thank you again, and everybody have a good night.